American whiskey boasts a fascinating history. In fact, whiskey influenced some of the biggest events in American history. By following America's thirst for fine spirits, we'll find an intriguing tale as big and bold as America itself. The craft of distilling came to America with the first settlers. As these settlers moved west over the Appalachian Mountains into western Pennsylvania, Virginia, and what would become Kentucky, they continued to distill but used the new grains that flourished in America as opposed to the traditional grains of their homeland. The soil in these areas was good for grain. Corn was indigenous to these parts and was one of the first crops cultivated by the newly settled farmers. Kentucky was the first American West, the Wild West of the 1770s. In order to live there, early settlers needed to bring with them everything they needed to survive. It was a hard life on the frontier. From sunup to sundown, the people would work to clear the land, plant the seeds, build homes, and harvest their crops. Using their surplus grains to make beer was common, but beer was perishable, and farmers could only make what could be conceivably consumed in the near future. Early whiskey was corn whiskey. Distilling surplus corn was a good business for the farmers. Corn whiskey wasn't subject to rot, mold, rats, or other infestations. It was easier to transport to market than sheaves and stocks, and the high-proof product was worth more than the grain it was made with. The whiskey was stored in jugs, which were cheaper than barrels. Jugs were also a practical size for trading in the barter economy of the American frontier. On the frontier, farmers could only produce around 10 gallons per day on the stills they had, which wasn't enough to fill barrel sizes of the time. Meanwhile, back in New England, colonists had established a booming rum trade, importing sugar and molasses and exporting rum. When the British got wind of this American industry, they quickly imposed a tax on American products imported by other countries. The tax ensured that the products from the American colonies posed no competition to British goods, and reminded the colonist who was in charge. This was one of the many injustices that led to the Revolutionary War. Fast forward, we win! But the victory wasn't cheap. The war left the fledgling United States of America around $80 million in debt. In order to pay off this debt, our first Secretary of Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, instituted the first nationwide internal revenue tax, which was an excise tax on distilled spirits. The tax was designed to move the new nation into a more industrialized economy. In practice, it favored urban distillers over farm-based distilleries. In the large industrial distilleries, the spirit was taxed right off the still, and production volumes could be accurately assessed and taxed accordingly. However, the tax collectors on the frontier assessed taxable volume by still size, estimating maximum yield for 6 months per year. But most farmers only distilled for 3 months out of the year. The payment also had to be made with hard currency, a commodity nearly impossible to find in the rural West. With the unjust taxes levied by the British still fresh in their minds, the farmers' tempers hit a boiling point. The tax opposition soon escalated to anti-tax violence. News of the Whiskey Rebellion, as it became known, reached President Washington. After several attempts to diplomatically quell the revolt, Washington called up the militia, mustering nearly 13,000 men from 4 states to put down the rebellion in western Pennsylvania. The violence ended a month later, but opposition to the tax persisted until it was repealed by President Thomas Jefferson. In 1803, in the real estate deal of the century, Jefferson doubled the size of the country by writing one check. The Louisiana Purchase gave the United States control over the Mississippi River and the port of New Orleans. This opened up new markets and transportation routes to American farmers and distillers. But in the early 1800s, Kentucky whiskey was not the bourbon we know today. There's no definitive evidence that defines when and why the term bourbon began to be associated with Kentucky whiskey, although legends abound. Bourbon whiskey most likely came about in the latter part of the 18-teens. The first mention of bourbon on record was in the Bourbon County newspaper in 1821. Distilling became quite the business in the farming regions. Whiskey could be made using sweet mash, all fresh ingredients, or by using sour mash, reusing a portion of the spent mash in each new batch. This recycling of the mash reduced the amount of water used in a batch and kept the whiskey consistent. One of the earliest surviving recipes using sour mash is from 1818 in Casey County, Kentucky by Catherine Carpenter, a widow who continued her late husband's distillery. Before the Civil War, bulk goods were mostly sold in barrels. As distilleries grew bigger and produced more product, whiskey, too, was put into barrels. Manufacturers of commodities such as tobacco, wine, and whiskey would brand their names into the barrel head to identify the contents. In saloons and groceries, whiskey barrels sat on the top shelf above the bar and were tapped. The distillery would brand its name or trademark into the barrel head so that it was visible to patrons. This is how the term brand name originated. Brand names such as Old Crow and Old Tailor started gaining recognition as early as the 1830s. Flavoring spirits went hand in hand with distilling them. With the ingredients and the equipment they had to work with, farmer distillers did not make a consistent or necessarily good-tasting whiskey. Additives like sugar, juice, and spices were often used, as well as charcoal filtering to improve the taste. The practice of storing wine, brandy, and cognac in charred barrels to impart color and flavor went back centuries, and at some point in the early 19th century, aging whiskey in charred oak barrels was adopted by Kentucky distillers. The charred oak imparted a desired color and flavor on the spirit, while the charcoal filtered out some of the undesirable fusel oils. Kentucky was the ideal place for producing whiskey with its limestone filtered water, seasonal changes in temperature, fertile soil for growing grains, and an abundance of oak for barrels. Not to mention Kentucky's access to the Ohio River and abundance of rivers throughout the state. In fact, the state has more miles of navigable waterways than any other state in the lower 48, and Kentucky distillers were able to get their products into bigger markets downriver, like New Orleans. In the 1820s and 30s, the Industrial Revolution introduced new ways to connect people and places. As steam-powered ships were making their debut, the steam locomotive was also coming into use, which was vital to the expansion of the American West. Along with new road systems and canals, the transportation of goods became more widespread than ever before. As people got around, so did the reputation of Kentucky's fine whiskey. By the 1860s, the term bourbon whiskey seemed to be firmly established. The Industrial Revolution also brought about improvements in the whiskey production process. James C. Crowe, often erroneously credited with inventing the sour mash process, applied scientific principles to distilling. He recorded his processes and distillate specifications such as pH, temperature, specific gravity, and proof. The invention of the continuous still was one of the greatest advances for the industry. The continuous still allowed for fermented mash to be pumped continuously into the still so that large amounts of alcohol could be made quickly. The efficiency of the new process brought costs down, and the large column of the still allowed for alcohol to be distilled at a higher proof, leading to an abundance of cheap, neutral spirits. By this time, whiskey was in high demand, particularly Kentucky bourbon, and the aging process was holding up profits. Wholesale merchants, known as rectifiers, now had a new source of cheap, neutral spirits which they could use to stretch supplies of aged whiskey or simply color and flavor with ingredients such as burnt sugar and caramel. The resulting product did not come close to the taste of actual bourbon, but consumers had a thirst for it all the same. But rectifiers were not the only ones tampering with whiskey. Throughout the 19th century, bourbon was generally sold out of a barrel. The barrel was not tamper-proof, and the bourbon inside could have easily been watered down or cut with any manner of chemicals such as turpentine, spittoon waste, or distillate of tar. In 1870, George Garvin Brown recognized that bottling bourbon would give his product legitimacy, discourage tampering, and boast safety to customers. Old Forester was the first bourbon to be sold exclusively by the bottle. The disputes between the distillers and rectifiers turned political with the Bottled in Bond Act in 1897. The act provided for the production of whiskey under government supervision and set forth the standards of identity for distilled spirits. A bottle of bourbon marked with the Bottled in Bond seal had to be produced by one distillery in one season, aged at least 4 years in a government-bonded warehouse, and be bottled at 100 proof. Rectifiers were handed another blow with the passage of the Pure Food and Drug Act in 1906. This act required that products be accurately labeled with contents, thereby creating a safer consumer environment. Since products had to be defined, the question became, what is whiskey? President William Howard Taft, a former lawyer, decided to hear the case himself. Taft spent 6 months listening to both sides of the case, and finally reached the decision that would define straight whiskey and blended whiskey going forward to present day. The Taft decision required that whiskey be made from grain, not sugar or molasses. The Prohibition era is the period of time from 1920 to 1933, when the 18th Amendment to the Constitution made it illegal to produce, transport, and sell alcohol in the United States. The result was crippling to the distilling industry. Distilleries across the country were forced to close. Only the sale of alcohol for medicinal purposes was permitted. Permits were issued by the government to distilleries for the bottling of medicinal whiskeys. Even then, they only permitted the use of existing stocks. It is worth noting that 10 permits were available for suppliers, but only 6 were applied for. The following distilleries obtained these 6 permits: Brown-Forman, Frankfurt Distillery, Glenmore, American Medical Spirits, Schenley Distillery, and A.P.H. Stitzel Distillery. The 18th Amendment to the Constitution is the only amendment to have been repealed. Prohibition ended on December 5, 1933, right in the middle of the Great Depression. The bourbon industry was nearly devastated by Prohibition. Stores of aged bourbon were critically low and many distilleries had closed. Companies trying to get started could not get a foothold in the economic environment. In addition, during the dry years when good aged whiskey had been hard to come by, the public had developed a taste for gin. Bootleggers made a crude version of compound gin with cheap, unaged spirits, adding oil of juniper and anything else that made it palatable. While bourbon distilleries got back into production as fast as possible, their products took time to age. In the meantime, blended and flavored whiskeys gained popularity. Canada, Ireland, and Scotland had plenty of whiskey to supplement the shortage, overtaking American products. Distillers used neutral spirits and flavoring to stretch existing stocks and improve young whiskeys. By the time good bourbon was back on the shelves, consumer taste had changed. It was a hard road back that was impeded once again by another national crisis. When America entered World War II, the War Production Board assumed control of the distilling industry and oversaw a transition from the production of beverage alcohol to industrial alcohol. It took 23 gallons of industrial alcohol to make a Jeep. 20 gallons were needed to produce one 16-inch naval shell, and 1 gallon was needed in order to make 64 hand grenades or 2 155mm howitzer shells. Bourbon supplies once again dwindled, but the war had brought America out of its depression. When bourbon finally hit the shelves again, people had the discretionary income to spend on luxury items. With no restrictions on production and new innovations, distilleries were able to offer a variety of products at affordable prices. They also poured resources into marketing and packaging. In the 1960s, as bourbon's international market share grew, the United States Congress recognized bourbon as a distinctive product of the United States. It was also in 1962 that the barrel entry proof was raised to 125, finalizing the legal definition of bourbon as we know it today. But by the late 1960s, the unpopularity of the Vietnam War sparked a generation of rebellious young people who rejected everything their parents stood for, including their whiskey. Beer, wine, vodka, and tequila became the libations of choice. The free love and decadence of the 60s and 70s social scene catered to the fun-loving crowd and was rife with overindulgence. In the 1980s, when the recession hit, the social culture began to move away from carefree drinking to a more discerning consumer who demanded quality for their hard-earned money. The wine industry took advantage of consumer taste by creating wine clubs, magazines, and organized tastings. Single malt Scotch producers took their products to a premium level in the US by doing the same, and the bourbon makers took notice. Bourbon makers began to elevate their products by releasing new lines that competed with the premiumization of the wine and Scotch industries. Single barrel and small batch bourbons appealed to the discriminating taste of the knowledgeable consumer. As demand grew, distilleries opened their doors to visitors and took advantage of tourism. Bourbon has become the subject of books, blogs, news stories, and documentaries. It has risen from the Great Bourbon Depression of the 1960s and 70s and is booming today, thanks in part to tremendous marketing and lobbying efforts and to the pride and tradition that goes into every drop of such a fine spirit.